Okay, welcome to my webinar on massed versus spaced practice for EDU570. My name is Julia Scott, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with a quick pre-assessment, so just go ahead and answer with your letter choice in the chat, and I'm going to address the answers in during my webinar. I'm not going to go over them immediately. So question 1, how does spaced practice differ from mass practice? A, spaced practice involves continuous repetition, while mass practice includes break. B, spaced practice involves reviewing material over increasing intervals, while mass practice involves consecutive repetitions. C, spaced practice is only effective for simple concepts, while mass practice is suitable for complex topics. And D, spaced practice requires longer study sessions compared to mass practice. So go ahead and answer in the chat. Question 2, true or false? The primary goal of spaced practice in education is to help students memorize information. True or false? Okay. And our last question, which technology tool is commonly used to implement spaced practice in educational settings? A, social media platforms, B, learning management systems, C, video conferencing tools, or D, entertainment streaming devices. Excellent. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to address is why practice is important in assessment and what practice is. So we are practicing content with our students every time they are interacting with it. So every time they're exposed to the content and they're rehearsing that, whether they're doing that verbally, kinesthetically, visually, they are practicing it. And practice doesn't just have to be within education. Practice can also be if you are at basketball practice, if you are practicing drawing for the first time. So not only is practice important when we are teaching our students, you can implement these rules in terms of spaced and mass practice to any scenario that you're trying to learn a new skill. Okay, practice is also important, and the way that I'm going to talk about practice is important is because we as educators are looking for the best outcomes for our students, whether it be for a summative assessment and we want them to perform well on the KSA, or if it's just for seeing overall student growth, we want to yield the best results as possible, which is important, which is why it's important to use the highest yield learning strategies that we can. Practice can fall on any level of Bloom's taxonomy. So if you're just asking students to recall what they remember from a lesson and you're asking them to remember something, or if you're asking them to practice with content by creating something, that is still considered practice. So I added a list of kind of overall a Bloom's list over here. So maybe you're completing a science lab that synthesizes skills from class with a current problem in the community. That would also be considered practice. All right, so the two kinds of practice I wanted to talk about are spaced versus mass practice. So these kinds of practices both require the exact same amount of time from the learner. So mass practice differs from spaced practice in that the initial study time is normally really close to the review, and you are cramming or all of your time that you're practicing the skill is back to back to back. Now, spaced practice is when you have an initial study, you're introducing the content to the student for the first time, and then you have a pause or you have an interval before you review the content again. I'm going to talk about how those two practices yield different results. And I've added a couple examples here of what spaced practice looks like. So spaced practice might be that you have study sessions at spaced intervals. One day, you skip a couple days, and then you skip a few more days before you have a test. Or reviewing a concept in class for 15 minutes at a time every other day for a spaced amount of time. One of the misconceptions about mass practice is that it's easier because it feels easier. Students see that like, oh, I can wait and push off my studying until the night before an exam, if I cram the night before and I do well, it feels like that works really well. But the science and the brain science says differently, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Okay, so this is the forgetting curve, which was founded by the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus in the late 1800s. This basically demonstrates how after that first initial exposure to content, so you can see on day 0, when we first show students what we're learning, after days after the learning, if we are not exposing them to it again, our retention lags, right? We lose our memory of what we've talked about. Now, if we show our students the content, we expose it to them on day 0, and then we wait for an interval of a day, and then space it out even more for a couple days, our overall retention improves. So you can see that after multiple days, our retention of the content improves over time. This is going to depend on the strength of the memory. So we're going to talk about how to create stronger memories within our students and the time that's been passed since the information was learned, right? So over time, you're going to want to space out your content even more as you introduce it to students. There are lots of benefits of space practice versus mass practice. So one of the misconceptions is that space practice is for memorizing information, making sure students have it up in their brain. But it's also really important that students have that information and they can apply it to new scenarios. That's what we're going to call enhanced transferability. If you're showing content to students in different scenarios and you're asking them to apply their knowledge and then asking them to evaluate something and then asking them to create something, it's going to make sure that they're able to transfer that knowledge to different scenarios. And so when you're introducing it to students, you want to make sure you're doing it in different ways. We also see that students have long-term retention when you're spacing the practice, just like we saw from the forgetting curve. So space practice consolidates the memories because it's creating schema. And we're going to look at a brain infographic here in a second that demonstrates that. You also see that space practice minimizes interference. Now, interference in the brain is when you are learning things back to back to back. Let's say you have a lesson on you're learning vocabulary words in Spanish. If you are constantly introducing new vocabulary words Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, when you ask students to recall those words on Thursday, they might confuse the words with each other because they haven't had time to process it in between. So that's interference between concepts in kids' brain. And spacing that practice can allow time for students to consolidate that memory and be able to recall it better and more accurately later. So this is what's happening in the brain during practice. So during space practice, you have synapses that are making connections with one another and then releasing neurotransmitters. So those synapses making connections every single time, like you can see in this graphic down here, every single time that you ask students to retrieve that information and those synapses make a connection, it's strengthening that connection and forming a schema about the topic. When it releases a neurotransmitter, sometimes that neurotransmitter can be something like dopamine. And so it creates a positive experience for the learner when they are rehearsing at spaced intervals. It also helps memory formation because you can see that when we first have stimulus from the environment, we first have an exposure from students, it enters into our sensory memory, which is just what we're experiencing simultaneously with what we're experiencing in the classroom. That can soon be forgotten unless we rehearse the information and it's brought into our short-term memory. This is normally what's happening with mass practice, is we've transferred that information from our sensory memory to our short-term, and then we quickly forget it after we take a test. But as you start retrieving, retrieving that information from the long-term memory, then that stays in the long term for longer amounts of time, especially after you space out that practice for longer amounts of time. Now, when you are massing your practice, you're cramming all at once, your brain gets very fatigued because it can only handle so much information at the same time. We call that cognitive load. And if you remember from your psychology class, there's a bottleneck effect. If we have so much information coming into the brain, you can only process so much. So a lot of the information is going to be forgotten. So if you have really long lessons, for example, you're talking in direct instruction for like 30, 40 minutes of your class period, a lot of the information is going to be lost in the bottleneck. There's also limited consolidation. So as those schemas are formed, the lack of breaks hinders the brain to form synaptic connections and it reduces retention, okay? And you can kind of see these synapses down here as they're making connections. As they are connecting, it's reminding, as it's harder to remember, it's reminding your brain to remember it, okay? So here is an example of a case study that I found from 2018, conducted by W.K. Emeny and M.K. Hartwig. They were studying two groups of 7th grade math students. One group was practicing space practice and the other was mass practice, and they were working on permutation problems and Venn diagram problems. Each group had the same amount of problems, so they each had 12 problems, but the space group practiced 4 problems at a time after they first modeled the concepts. Then they waited a week, modeled another 4 problems, waited a week and did another 4, and then they waited 4 weeks until the test. They did the same thing with the mass condition, except after the modeling, they just did all 12 problems at once, and then they waited 4 weeks. The reason why I chose this particular study is because they also asked students, one of the variables was to ask students to make predictions about how they would perform on the test. So they would make a prediction before they learned about the concept, a prediction after they practiced the problems, and then a post-diction, like how they thought they performed on the test after they took it. Here are the results. So in experiment 1, the group who spaced practice, their initial prediction is right here at like a 2.5. They practiced the problems again within another week, predicted again how they would perform on the test, and then took the test and predicted how they performed, okay? You can see here that when they spaced practice, the students' predictions of how they were doing was a lot more accurate compared to when you mass practice. Now, the reason why I feel like this is really significant is if students can predict how well they're doing, is they can also predict, or they can also plan to study ahead. So if students are like, I do not think I'm going to perform well, I don't feel like I am aligned with where the teacher's expectations are, then they know to go back and study that content before the test. Obviously, not all students are going to do the same thing, but if students are thinking about their learning and being metacognitive, they're going to be more actively engaged in the class, and they're going to be more present with where they stand in our classes. The other thing is that the spacing effect, which is the effect that Hattie talks about with that 0.6 effect size, the spacing effect had no correlation to the KS2 SAT. So this is when they looked at the students' prior test scores from the year before in math, and they determined that all students saw significant improvement in proficiency, regardless of how they performed on their state testing. So this is really important so that all students can benefit and realize that they are able to learn. So as you're practicing with your students, there are a few ways that it should look in your class. Number 1 is these should be frequent low stakes retrieval from long-term memory. So rather than having a really long lesson and a really long review game all at one time, we want to have really short quizzes, really short reflections, and asking questions of students just to get like a formative assessment of how they're doing. These should also be really low stakes. If students are under test anxiety, they're going to perform worse than they would if it was just like a exit slip or a bell ringer or something of that fashion. The next thing is that every time you expose a student another time to the material and you're reviewing again or practicing again, you should add a little bit more of content and make connections to the past exposure. That's helping to form schema and make those synaptic connections that we talked about stronger. And it's also really helpful if you connect the information to the student. We know that making connections to each student's prior knowledge to what they already know or something that they're interested in is going to make the learning stronger and more engaging. The next thing is that you are introducing that content at a desirable level of difficulty. So each time that you're exposing, you should also make it a little bit harder and make sure that it's within the student's zone of proximal development. So that way it's a little bit difficult for that student to make that retrieval to long-term memory. If it's an easy retrieval and they already know it, it's going to be really easy to forget. And the last thing is that you interleave content. And I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. So when you're interleaving content, You should do this by creating a curriculum map. This is the best way to space practice, because if you're going day by day and just on the fly, writing your lessons on Post-it notes, it's really difficult to create a spaced map of how your overall unit should look. So here's an example over here of a blocked practice, right? You're practicing A over and over and over again, practicing B over and over and over again, and then C, okay? Interleaved practice is when you have kind of shifted how you're practicing with your students, okay? So you're gonna do B one day, and then maybe you come back to B in a couple weeks, and that way you're engaging students by not having them bored doing the same thing over and over and over again, making the lessons predictable. But you're also asking them to kind of mix things up within your classroom, and it makes it more effective, okay? We talked about reviewing content periodically, writing reflections and questioning. So those are a couple ways to use that in your classroom. Here's an example of how I might use this in my own content area. So I'm an art teacher, and one thing that we teach students at the very beginning of the year is some basic drawing skills and basic drawing techniques to help their confidence as learners. So the first thing I would do is create a curriculum calendar, a curriculum map that interleaves different kinds of drawing practices. So I might have them switch between drawing from observation and shading. I'm going to also interleave different art mediums and activities to expand their breadth of knowledge. So I might say, draw this apple from observation with vine charcoal on day 1. On day 2, we're going to do a shading worksheet with colored pencil. And then on day 3, we are going to do continuous line drawings of our partners and do a collaborative group project. I should also make connections to the students and to their prior knowledge. So each day I'm building on that knowledge, and I'm also connecting with the students. So I might bring up a TikTok artist that they might have known. I might bring up an artist from art history they might know, and I'm making connections to expand that schema. I'm also increasing difficulty every day that we're working on this drawing skill. So every day I'm making the drawing a little bit more difficult and upping the ante so that they're applying their knowledge to new situations, and they're increasingly getting harder work in class, okay? Now, as we are practicing, I want to make sure that I'm giving each student clear and specific feedback so that they know coming into the next day how they're going to improve on their learning. Technology can also really help with planning spacing practice, so that takes a little bit off of the teacher. The first way is to do this in your own classroom. Gamification is wonderful for engaging students. I'm going to talk about the benefits of that in a second, but a couple are Kahoot and quizzes. So you can schedule Kahoots at various intervals, and quizzes and Socratic is another one that you can assign at specific intervals. And quizzes and Socratic, you can actually assign to individual students as an assignment rather than doing as a group. And it will make the questions increasingly harder for them so that it's at a desirable level of difficulty. The second thing is within the entire school body. So approaching your admin about changing the way that you're presenting content to students school-wide. So learning management systems are basically a way that you can deliver content, you can assign assessments, and you can basically organize grades and see student progress throughout a unit, throughout a semester or a year, okay? So you can do all sorts of things with a learning management system, but it's most effective if you have, it's a school-wide policy. So for example, my school uses Google Classroom. So every one of their classes they have through Google Classroom, and all of their teachers can see them through there. And so the students are conditioned to use that app. But other ones like Moodle and Schoology are also really popular. And that's going to be a choice made by admin or your district. Here are a couple of the benefits of gamification that I was talking about. So you can obviously scaffold different levels of difficulty for students so they can reach the highest level of mastery. It can also exist in an episodic memory. So rather than repeating practice every time, if students win a game and it's super memorable, then they're more likely to remember that. And it's a more specific learning experience than maybe like writing down a note on their notebook. You can distribute the learning. So we're spacing practice when we're playing review games and doing that on special occasions. And then it can also be really intrinsically motivating for students and extrinsically motivating for students, because students feel a sense of accomplishment whenever they win a game, but then they also are like, I have to do this thing for school and I really want to win a trophy. So there's a couple ways that that can go. And then the same thing that I was talking about earlier about students' motivation and predictability and assessment with that one study. The same thing goes for gamification. So students are able to track their learning when they realize that they don't know the content as well. And when they are winning, it helps their self-efficacy and that they are like doing the thing, they're doing it well, and they're more likely to want to do it again. It helps their confidence. So here are a couple of tips I have for teachers. Number one, here is a like practical practice schedule to the right of like how you might implement space practice into your content area. So the first day you're delivering content, you teach them the thing. The second day you might revisit it a little bit and review. And then after a few days, you're reviewing and revisiting and maybe adding a little bit more to that level of difficulty. But it's also really important and really significant that we teach students how to study using space practice. We see so often in education that kids just do not know how to study, and then they forget the content after because they're staying up all night trying to practice for an exam. So it's really important to teach them how to chunk material, explaining why our learning objectives are important and how they connect to the standards, but explaining how our learning objectives are important and how we have chunked that for them so that they can do the same thing for themselves when they study, and then talking about how long they're studying and how they're doing it. I've emailed a couple of, or these three things to you, but one thing that I can really recommend is reading the book, Make It Stick. This is something that was really helpful to me at some point that Dr. Day assigned. It's called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. It talks a lot about spacing practice, a lot about the brain and how we actually learn things and how we can make it most effective for students. The next thing is a study planner that I have distributed to you all so that students can use this themselves to kind of track their own study habits. And it's kind of satisfying to make those check marks. So that is something I sent out. And then there's a couple handouts that go over what we talked about here that you can hang in your classroom or keep as reference. All right, here are my sources, and I am available for questions. All right, if we don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and close out the meeting. Thank you so much for joining and have a wonderful evening.